Hi, welcome back to Economics with Professor Klein at Cuesta College. Today's video is about nominal versus real GDP, and we'll also include the GDP deflator with this example. So behind me and uploaded as a Excel file, we have a too good simplified economy. Why are we doing too goods? Because you're going to see that there's quite a few calculations in this. So we're going to keep it simple. And then realize that this is just an example for you to understand how nominal works versus real. And for this example, we're doing GDP, gross domestic product. Okay, so in our perfect economy, we have two goods. We have textbooks, which of course are e-textbooks now, and internet access so that we can read those e-textbooks. All right, and so here we are in the year 2030, 2031, and 2032, okay? So nominal GDP says that we are simply going to ignore everything that's going on in other years and figure out how much was spent in this particular year, right? So when we do this, things to avoid, don't add the prices together, don't average them. Each one gives us different information about how valuable these items are. So the way that we calculate GDP, so nominal, we're going to use the letter N to denote nominal, right? Nominal GDP for 2030, right? So I'm just going to put this subscript 2030 to say that I'm calculating nominal GDP for 2030. And so the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to total up how much was spent on e-textbooks, and then I'm going to total up how much was spent on internet access and then add them together, right? So for e-textbooks, it costs $120. And 50 were purchased, right? And so you will probably want to grab a calculator and have that handy. All right, so in total, 120 times 50, we spent $6,000 on e-textbooks in 2030. But that's not the only thing we bought. We also bought internet access, which is an example of a service, right? E-textbook now is almost more like a service than a good. 100 times 70, right? And so that one's going to be 7,000. So what's our total GDP for that year? 13,000, right? So nominal GDP for 2030 is 13,000. And so we follow the same thing for 2031 and 2032. So again, in this time, what's going to happen is, notice that the quantities haven't changed, but the price of textbooks has, right? So what is this going to do? Well, this is going to raise our nominal GDP, but if we think about it, the quantity has stayed the same. So should it really be representing economic growth, right? And that's where we bring in real GDP, adjusting away the inflation that happens over time. So nominal GDP for 2031, right, is going to be 130 times 50. In this case, it's an extra $10 for 50 textbooks, so it should be 6,500. Let's just double check. It's always good to double check. Yep, 6,500. And we still sold 70 units of internet access at $100. So that's the same. And so now look at what happened to GDP, right? Nominal GDP went up by $500, but not because we produced more, because what we produced simply cost more. We'll come back to real GDP here in just a moment. So last one, nominal GDP in 2032. Right? We're going to do 130. Look what happened. We're selling fewer textbooks, right? Everybody got what they needed in 2030 and 31. Who knows? Maybe it's just a bad year, a coronavirus year maybe. 130 times 40. Now, only $5,200 has been spent on textbook. And then look what happens. Price of internet skyrockets. It's a 50% increase in the price of internet. So fewer people have bought them, right? But look at what happens if we only look at nominal GDP. So now we're going to do 150 times 60. And now we have 9,000. So look at what happened to nominal GDP. 14,200. So nominal GDP went up each and every year, right? So that's just telling us GDP has gone up, but look at what's going on here. From 2030 to 2031, only the price went up. So is this really economic growth, right? In 2031, 2032, the prices went up, which is why nominal GDP went up even more. But look at what happened to the quantities. We can see this, right? So this is why it's really important to understand real GDP. So what is real GDP? So real GDP says that we're going to use a base year and fix our prices to the base year. So to illustrate something, I'm going to choose a base year for 2031 because I want to show you something about the GDP deflator. All right. So you can always go back and look at these numbers. I'm going to erase this now because we're going to do the real GDP. So real GDP says that we're not going to use this year's values, this year's prices, I should say, but that we are going to use the base year prices, right? So let's put a box here, right? These are now our base year. And so again, the base year is just chosen, right? Whatever year makes sense, right? And we will update these base years. It's just a definition. That's what it is. So we're choosing a base year of 2031. And so now we're going to go back and recalculate because we aren't using this year's prices. We're using base year prices, but we're still using this year's quantities. All right. So what happens to real GDP? So now we're using 130. That's going to be the same each time for our textbooks, right? And we've sold 50. So our calculator, 130 times 50, 6,500. Right? And then again, we are not using the current year prices. Instead, we're using the base year prices. So we're doing 100 times 70. So now we're doing 7,000. So when we calculate real GDP for 2030, now we get 13,500, right? Whereas before we got 13,000. So this is where the GDP deflator comes in. We'll come back to that in just a moment, but you do nominal GDP over real GDP times 100. So we'll come back to what that's telling us in just a moment. So that was real GDP for 2030. Real GDP for 2031, well, we already calculated nominal GDP. The base year, nominal and real will always be the same, right? In the base year, whatever we choose for the base year, that is when the GDP deflator will be 100 because these two will be equal. Why? Because that's the definition. We're defining real GDP based upon what our base year is, right? So it's going to be equal to what our nominal GDP was. It also happens to be equal because I wanted to illustrate a point here. Has there been any economic growth between 2030 and 2031? And the answer is no. It stayed exactly flat. And if you actually have population increasing, then GDP per capita is going to decrease because it's going to be divided by a larger number, right? So why are we looking at real GDP instead of nominal? Well, nominal is the easiest information to collect, right? Nominal just says, hey, Apple, how many thousands of dollars worth of computers did you sell this year? Or I should say, how many millions or billions of dollars worth of computers have you sold this year? Apple says, this is how much we've sold. The Bureau of Economic Analysis goes, great, we're going to add that to consumption of GDP, right? So that's how we get to nominal. The question is, well, what happens to the price of these goods? And so we'll come back to that in just a moment. That's really where we get to the GDP deflator. So in this case, when we're looking from 2030 to 2031, there's been no economic growth, which we would not see if we were looking at nominal GDP. Now let's look from 2031 to 2032, still calculating real, meaning we're still going to be using these prices, right? So real GDP in 2032, right? We're going to fix the price at 130 still, and now we're multiplying it by this year's quantity, so by 40. Grab my handy dandy calculator. And we get 5,200, 5,200, right? How much are we spending on internet? Well, now it's $150. Sorry, we're keeping our price constant, sorry. And so it's $100, and now we've sold only 60. So now we're spending $6,000. And so our new real GDP is 11,200. What's happened from 2031 to 2032, which we didn't see when we were looking at nominal, because nominal went up each time when we were looking at it. Because prices were going up, even when the quantities stayed the same and we sold the same, because the price went up, real GDP went up, right? And from 2031 to 2032, we actually see real GDP dropping, right? Because the quantity, how much people have bought, has gone down. But it's at such a larger price that if we only look at nominal GDP, it actually looks like we have positive economic growth, right? So that's why we have to take away the amount of inflation. And the GDP deflator is one example of a price level. The second example of a price level that we use in this class is CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index. They both have their applications in different situations. The GDP deflator is what you should look at if you're trying to understand how much of the price of all goods have gone up, since 1965. If you want to know how much consumers have seen in inflation, then you want to do more of a fixed basket. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 7 with price levels and inflation. So as you see here, real GDP gets us a better concept of what's actually being produced. Right? And so when we look at real GDP, when we fix the price and ignore the effect of the price in what's being produced, then we get a clearer sense of, have we actually increased our production, or has it simply been increasing prices, right? So that's real GDP. And again, we can calculate the GDP deflator for each one. In 2031, it's going to be 100, because nominal was 13,500. And this is 13,500 times 100 is going to be 100. In the base year, it's 100. That's actually how you can find out what the base year is if you're not sure. For 2030, our nominal was 13,000. And so when we plug in 13,000 divided by 13,500, well, this is going to be a number less than 1. So this is going to be a number less than 100. That's okay. When it's equal to 100, it tells us that's the base year. When it's less than 100, that tells us that the prices are lower than they were in the base year. And when we plug it into for 2032, we're going to get a number that's larger than 100, right? Because now our nominal GDP, 130 times 40 was 5,200. Oops. Yep, that was the same. And then 150 times 60, 9,000. We had 14,200, right? There's our nominal divided by our real of 11,200. Multiply, that's times 100, and that is 126.7. There's no unit here. It's an index number, meaning it doesn't tell us anything. It just gives us a reference point. But essentially, this is telling us that if this was indeed our economy, we saw 26% inflation between 2031 and 2032. Right? So that's the value here of understanding what is nominal, what is real. And why do we include prices if they're always rising? Well, if we had included something that was a little bit different in prices, if we were looking at e-textbooks and say Expo markers, right? An Expo marker might be $1. Why is it $1? Because it doesn't produce as much. I throw these out roughly once a week, right? Versus internet access, I use this up throughout the month, but I get a lot more productivity from it. So prices are still a good representation of the value, of the production value that that good gives us, or sometimes consumption value. All right, so that's what nominal versus real is telling us nominal is the one that we understand. Real is the one that is useful for a cross-time comparison. Hope you found this helpful. See you around.